Hello, Governor. This is Anton, and you're watching Foreign Antoons. We have covered Russia, France, Italy, Germany, and this time we're going to the land of bad teeth and moody weather. That's right, we are finally covering British animation. Many animated works from the United Kingdom offer worlds that are familiar yet distinct, which a great number of people around the world enjoy. These works could be simple yet arguably somewhat charming kid shows. These works could have rather scary and dark imagery that other creators dare not depict. These works could also fall somewhere in between. Animation development in Britain went through several stages, often being influenced by changing factors ranging from cultures, economics, and politics. For some, British animation history can be divided into three waves. We will get more into those waves as we go. So let's not waste time and start taking a look at many of these bloody brilliant works. Now, animation has been thought to be based on a persistence of vision.
Motion pictures are based on an optical illusion. Just another case where seeing is believing.
This has been explained by British physician Peter Mark Rodgett. He noticed that while looking at a wheel while looking through a vertical aperture, like fence slats for example, no matter how rapidly a wheel revolves, each individual spoke within the wheel can appear to be still or at rest, as he put it. If the image is vivid enough, the mind can trick the eye into thinking that the spokes of the wheel are at rest. His details on the persistence of vision were in 1825 by the Royal Society, with the title Explanation of an Optical Deception in the Appearance of the Spokes of the Wheel Seen Through Vertical Apertures. Our brain essentially takes snapshots and induced that movement occurred because of how positions changed. So our brains interpret animation as not a succession of images, but instead moving images. Some years later, a Belgian scientist named Joseph Plateau introduced an item made in London, which helped further explore the persistence of vision. What he introduced was stroboscopic animation in 1833. It has already been known as the phenakistoscope in Paris, but it was christened the phantasmoscope and later the phantascope in London. After some time, there were many people who have created their own phantascopes in Britain. English-born Edward Muybridge used his photography skills to create a series of sequential photographs of animals in motion in 1872. These are live-action photos, but many artists and animators have used these sequence pictures for reference. A small tidbit, but in 1895, lighting cartoonist Tom Merry was filmed as he drew a picture of Kaiser Wilhelm. This drawing was filmed by Britt Ackers and was considered by some to arguably be the first animated British short. More on that in a moment. Now we move on to Arthur Melbourne Cooper, who is the man who brought animation to British film by using stop motion. It seems fitting in hindsight, because the United Kingdom seems arguably to be the most fond of stop motion compared to many other countries. I'm getting ahead of myself, however. Arthur produced a short stop-motion commercial in 1899 for the company Brimey, and it was titled Matches, an Appeal. It really does seem like matches are a popular subject for stop-motion in the early days, doesn't it? So in this film, the matches were shaped into stop-frame puppets, which are depicted in the film drawing on a blackboard. Now, some say that not long after that film, Walter R. Booth made a trick film in 1901 called The Devil in the Studio. It is said that it involved some sort of animation, though it might be lost, so we can't say for sure. But regardless, some say that, or even the previously mentioned Tom Merry drawing Kaiser Wilhelm, were technically the first animated shorts in Britain. However, what has now been considered the first proper animated film is Arthur's 1901 live-action and stop-motion combination, Dolly's Toys. The movie seems to be either hard to find or even lost, but Arthur had a similar movie in 1907 titled Dreams of Toyland. At the same time, people like Booth, Dudley Buxton, and Anson Dyer came out with films that used cutouts mixed with lighting sketch films. All of these helped further development in animation. There are only a few examples of animation that still remain in some viewable form. Examples include Bully Boy, which features mainly sketching before animation in the last portion, and John Bull's Sketchbook, which depicts a live-action hand drawing a picture before the picture itself moves through the power of animation. While the British know how to animate animate with cells, they do tend to prefer cutouts and three-dimensional models. Like I said before, the British have a great fondness for stop motion. Some cartoons in the early days that were made with cutouts include The Wonderful Adventures of Pip, Squeak and Wilfred, based on a comic strip by Bertram Lamb, and Bonzo, based on a dog character created by comic strip artist George Studdy. However, there was another character that came out in not too long that moved a bit closer to cell animation as well. That character was Jerry the Tyke, and the cartoon was inspired from the American cartoons Felix the Cat and the Fleischers out of the Inkwell series, so there is certainly some resemblance to those old cartoons. In the next in line for animation that never fully saw the light of day, Anson Dyer wished to create a movie titled The Story of the Flag. It could have been Britain's first feature-length animated movie. His producer soon lost interest, however, and instead commissioned Anson to make 6 shorts instead. As the process of what could be done with animation grew, Disney were the ones who could do 3-color Technicolor until 1934, and no one else had the option to do so at the time. The British had other systems of colorization such as Dunning color, but the first use of Technicolor did not come in Britain until 1936 with the short The Fox Hunt. As animation was developing as a form of art, it was also developing as a form of communication for the general public. This is the beginning of the waves I mentioned before, so we are of course starting with the first wave, the establishment of the industry. So with this new development in communication, the government post office, or the GPO, allowed filmmakers to experiment and be creative with the films that promote the postal service. Animators like Norman McLaren and Len Lyle were hired by the studio and created quite a few films for GPO, and also made animated shorts for themselves not long afterwards. Len Lyle was known for A Color Box and Rainbow Dance. Norman McLaren made Camera Makes Whoopee and Hell Unlimited. He also later made Love on the Wing to advertise airmail services, but it got banned by the post office for the imagery being considered too erotic. The Ministry of Information soon took over the GPO, which allowed some smaller studios to begin to thrive, such as Halas and Batchelor and Larkin's. Larkin's is known for making animated projects as sort of documentaries, like Tea for Teacher to show how to make tea of the time of rationing, or William Larkin's own directed short film Rivers of Steel as a promotion for the British Iron and Steel Federation.
This is the river of molten iron.
The other studio, Halas and Batchelor, became one of the leading European animation companies. The beginning came from John Halas and Joy Batchelor first meeting in London in 1937. Halas came from Budapest to help set up a company called British Colour Cartoon Films Limited, and Batchelor answered an animator advertisement from that same company. Halas then immediately hired her on the spot. However, Halas does not speak English, so he thought it would be more practical and cheaper to have his first animated film, Music Man, made back in his studio in Budapest. He only moved back to London when World War II was about to start. Halas and Batchelor first illustrated posters, books and magazines, but then worked with the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency by producing ads like Carnival in the Clothes Cupboard for Lux and Train Trouble for Kellogg's. Soon the war caused a rise in necessitating the spread of information and propaganda. Halas and Batchelor were encouraged by John Grierson, the founder of the documentary film movement, and the couple saw the potential animation could have to help spread information and propaganda. They then started Halas and Batchelor cartoon films, and the two later married each other. They made over 100 cartoons by 1950. This included works like Dustbin Parade and the Abu series. They even made some feature-length films that act as training for the military. Those films are handling ships and water for firefighting. Even after the war, they continued to work with the government by promoting social security plans with the Charlie series. They had also made The Shoemaker and The Hatter.
To work so long for so little. Why not be like the Hatter? But when shoes are needed so badly, surely he should make...
And think of the future, created to promote the Marshall Plan and recovery of Europe. The experience and pressure helped Halas and Batchelor develop a strong graphic style. They went on experimental route with some films too, like with Magic Canvas, Poet and Painter, The Owl and the Pussycat, and The Figurehead. The experience and pressure also helped them produce longer works for adult audiences, something that made the company Halas and Batchelor stand out from others in the United Kingdom at the time. They even produced the groundbreaking 1954 animated feature Animal Farm, based on the George Orwell novel of the same name. It stood out from the imported animated content of the United States at the time, thanks to being more adult-oriented and explicit with its political commentary. The company continued with some award-winning experimental films like History of the Cinema, Automania 2000,
resulted in an inexhaustible flood of consumer goods and a worldwide affluent society.
and Dilemma. Many of these personal projects were funded thanks to the work commissioned from the other companies like Shell, BP, and British Gas, making films like As Old as the Hills.
You could hardly imagine a more unlikely-looking place, but this is where our oil story begins, on the seabed. In those
Moving Spirit,
The piston draws in a mixture of gas and air. The mixture is compressed and ignited. The explosion drives the piston back, and the burnt gases are pushed out.
we've come a long way.
Instead. There you are, 13 tons apiece.
Ah, and what sort of freight do I bring back with all those tanks blocking up my...
And Power to Fly.
From the converted bomber, it was only a short step to the large passenger aircraft, with everyone under cover.
They later made TV shows like Foo, Habit Tales, and Snip and Snap. They even made a few films for the BBC called Tales from Hoffnung, based on the caricatures of artist and musician Gerard Hoffnung. They soon started getting work for commissions for series across the pond, including Popeye and an animated version of The Lone Ranger. As the studio expanded, John Halas sold some of his shares to Tyne Tees Television. Tyne soon took over and contributed to more series like Tomfoolery and The Addams Family. While Tyne continued his reign over Halas and Batchelor, John and Joy soon moved to their other company, Educational Film Center, and produced concept films and a few language teaching films, Les Aventures de la Famille Carré for French, Martian in Moscow for Russian, and The Carters of Greenwood for English. John Halas brought back and continued making cartoons, some of them sponsored like with COI, UNICEF and UNESCO, and some of them more personal like children making cartoons. Halas and Batchelor had also made some technical achievements, like with the previously mentioned The Owl and the Pussycat and Dilemma, the former being made in stereoscopic film and the latter being one of the first digitally produced films. There was even Autobahn, which was one of the first films made using computer animated sequences. Now the British did attempt to directly compete with companies like Disney at their own game. J. Arthur Rank even hired the director of Bambi, David Hand, and had him come over to England in order to run the company known as GB Animation in 1946. Many of the animators at this company were former servicemen. They mainly work in advertisements, but did also create two series that were popular at the time, which were musical Paintbox and Animaland. However, their creations were not economically sound, and GB Animation closed their doors in 1950, only being in business for about 4 or 5 years. While that was happening though, the British also began experimenting with television. They mainly focused on shows for audiences of young children, and they went about creating them through puppets. Not stop-motion puppets, but the ones that are controlled by string. However, one television show that came out of this style was the children's book character Noddy. This character had been brought back with each passing decade, switching styles to stop-motion, and then eventually CGI in the recent years. There was even one show simply called Noddy that was a co-production with Canada. It had live-action humans and puppets, but also showed some stop motion by reusing segments from the show Noddy's Toyland Adventures. This was mainly North Americans' introduction to Noddy. Getting back to stop motion, that is unsurprisingly what eventually dominated British television, as this technique in animating cutouts and models had some of the same resources and skill sets as live-action puppetry. One of the men who was able to use both live-action puppets and frame-by-frame stop motion was Gordon Murray, who worked on the segment The Wooden Tops on Watch with Mother and the stop-motion shows Camberwick Green, Trumpton, and Chigley. All three are actually related, as they feature the same fictional county, Trumptonshire, so the trio of shows became known as the Trumpton Trilogy. Two other people, Oliver Postgate and Peter Furman, created stop-motion shows using both models and cutouts, and those shows are Back Puss, Ivor the Engine, Noggin the Nog, Penguins, Clangers, and Poggley's Wood. Even a children's author, Michael Bond, made a few stop-motion properties. He made The Herbs, which is about personifications of different herbs.
Is Miss Jessup. I like everything tidy and all just in place. But all of the other herbs make such a mess up. The state of the garden's a dreadful disgrace.
Quite a few of which are made into animals. Michael made a spin-off of the show titled The Adventures of Parsley. Unlike the original show, the animal herbs have the ability to talk in the spin-off. Many of these are often simple shows, which usually have a charming narrator telling the story of each episode, sometimes acting as the characters within the story, or sometimes having other people provide dialogue for the characters. Sometimes they brought other shows that fit their style, like taking the French show The Magic Carousel and turning into The Magic Roundabout. This show was pretty much rewritten to the point of hardly resembling the original French version, and the British enjoyed it.
Roll up, roll up! I have a special announcement. To me, everyone, to me. Come along, don't be shy. Now, where is everyone? Never here when you want them.
The original show had a French movie titled Dougal and the Blue Cat that was also dubbed in English, and a CGI movie. The latter movie was also dubbed in American English as Dougal, rather infamously, I might add. It was directed by the ever-so-controversial Butch Hartman and added unnecessary pop culture references and fart jokes.
Excellent reflexes. There is no spoon.
There was also a CGI version of the Magic Roundabout show, though many people say that the new version was not very good. As the 50s went on and even moved into the 60s, creators started experimenting more with animation. There is a company that rose to prominence called the British Film Institute's Experimental Film Fund. They funded some smaller films like Mel Kalman's The Arrow, Peter King's 13 Cantos of Hell, Peter and Joan Falder's A Short Vision, and Animated Genesis. Some animators even set up their own groups, like Bob Godfrey setting up Biographic. He and his company created the do-it-yourself cartoon kit. At the same time, the music that was made around this time became an inspiration for many artists, so much so that an entire animated movie was based around the band, arguably the most famous band of all time, the Beatles. George Dunning came from Canada and was the one that breathed life into the animated adventures of the Beatles, which is known as Yellow Submarine. Before that film, he already worked on the television cartoon about the Beatles, so he already had some familiarity with the band. Yellow Submarine took some of the aesthetics used by the company UPA and implemented them to their advantage, displaying a visual style that seemed to reflect the music, and this visual style is what many would describe as psychedelic. They even had style changes while playing different songs, like a sequence for the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds that was made using the rotoscoping technique. Another song sequence using Eleanor Rigby was made with both rotoscoping and cutouts. George Dunning had also made other animated projects like The Ladder and Damon the Mower. A few years after Yellow Submarine, a man named Terry Gilliam would join the comedy troupe Monty Python, and he would contribute his own distinctive animation style to their sketch show Monty Python's Flying Circus. He would use anarchic cutout animation that employed motifs drawn from British culture, localities, and figures. Deviations such as these from more common styles of squash and stretch from Disney or Warner Brothers became a staple for Britain's boutique-driven animated culture. Now in the 1970s, while the British were experimental, they still had a push for mostly child-friendly entertainment. One prominent example is the Mr. Men series. Mr. Men was a series of children's books created by Roger Hargreaves, beginning in 1971. A decade later, a female version of the books, known as the Little Miss series, was published. Hargreaves also made a similar series of books, but with animal characters, titled Timbuktu. These books were very simple, with the characters having names that correspond with their character trait, like Mr. Tickle or Little Miss Sunshine. The Timbuktu animals are named after the noises they make, like woof for dog and meow for cat, for example. In terms of animation, a Mr. Men series was produced and broadcasted from 1974 to 1978. A Little Miss series was made in 1983. In 1995 to 1997, a Mr. Men and Little Miss show was produced. It was brought over to America in 1997 as just the Mr. Men show, where it featured live-action segments and episodes redubbed by Canadian-American actors. In 1998 to 2000, Timbuktu received its own series. Finally, in 2008, another show titled The Mr. Men Show was produced and aired, even being broadcasted in North America on Cartoon Network. However, even with shows meant for young kids, they still used animation to experiment with what can be done. An example is Vision On, created by Ursula Eason and Patrick Dowling and presented by Pat Kiesel and Tony Hart. This show was used to be able to communicate with children who are deaf. They would have quite a few animated segments on the show and also allowed a number of animation talents to grow. These segments include The Gallery, which showed off works sent in by the show's audience, The Burbles, which involves people living in a grandfather clock who converse with each other in speech bubbles, The Prof, involving a man in a white coat doing humorous things, Humphrey the Tortoise, a tortoise making a joke or pun to himself or someone else. What he's saying is shown on screen with no audio. The Digger, a cutout show where someone is shoveling at a construction site until he finds something interesting. The animation for that is done by Bill Mather and George Dunning. The Animated Clock, a cuckoo clock which either has signs of trouble or has parts of itself come to life. A small animated man sometimes wanders in a surreal world and talks to the clock's bird. The Wolfumpus, which is a fuzzy worm that the crew chases after. And finally Aardman, some of the earliest works of Peter Lord and David Sproxton. The most notable segments they made were the Greeblies, which were a predecessor to a creation we will mention later, and Aardman, a superhero whose name is what the company Aardman was named after. There were also live-action shows like Take Heart, which replaced Vision On and was presented by Tony Hart. Take Heart has a few animated segments which featured the Aardman character Morph, one of the studio's first major projects. The show Take Heart was eventually replaced by Heartbeat, where the Morph segments continued before going into the program S-Mart or Smart. Morph also had his own show, The Amazing Adventures of Morph. Its follow-up show was The Morph Files, mixing old and new segments. The character has appeared on and off ever since, either in a new show for himself or as a segment on another show. The initial success of Morph and Aardman's earlier projects allowed them to expand to other projects. Not too long after Morph's first appearance, Aardman then made 2 shorts of animated conversations, shorts based on real recordings of ordinary people.
But we can't give you a ticket to go in there. This is something.
The 2 shorts were Down and Out and Confessions of a Foyer Girl. Of course, they've done more stop-motion work, but I don't want to get ahead of myself right now. Another show that used stop-motion at the time of Morph's existence was The Wombles, based on a series of children's books by Elizabeth Beresford. These underground creatures often collect the rubbish that humans throw away in order to recycle them. There were also some other shows that experimented with animation in Britain. One example of experimentation was Paddington, a character who originally appeared on the children's book A Bear Called Paddington by the previously mentioned author Michael Bond. The show Paddington has a mix of 3-dimensional model interacting with 2-dimensional drawings and black and white line backgrounds. There were also adaptations of Paddington using animation, one by Hanna-Barbera, another by Cinar Films, and the last one was animated by Blue Zoo Productions. The last show, titled The Adventures of Paddington, was made as a continuation of the live-action films. I heard that the company who animated this version usually does computer-generated images, but it does look like it was done with stop-motion, which is a noble attempt. One more example I'll bring up of experimenting is on a simple animated show called Rhubarb. Rhubarb is about the titular green dog and a pink cat named Custard. The dog often has a misadventure and he is filled with enthusiasm, and the cynical cat usually likes to sabotage his fun. It differs in each episode on who is victorious in the end. The style is deliberately rough, using marker pens, as well as a sketch sketchy drawing technique known as boiling lines, making each image on the show unique. It was used to help contrast it with the Hanna-Barbera cartoons airing on British television at the time. Ed, Edd and Eddy used that same boiling technique too, and it's one of the reasons why it's my favorite show. The boiling line makes the drawings feel much more alive. Anyway, the series did get a revival, as Rhubarb and Coster too. It used computer animation but still tried to keep the boiling line look from the original show. Of course, experimentation also came in movies, as 1978 saw the release of Watership Down. It was based on an adventure novel by Richard Adams and directed by the film's producer Martin Rosen. It was originally going to be directed by John Hubley, who is known for his work on UPA and even creating Mr. Magoo. He ultimately left due to disagreements with Martin, but some of John's animation was left in the final product. It was noticeably darker and more adult compared to most cell animated movies made at the time. I also don't mean adult like Fritz the Cat or The Simpsons, as both are considered adult comedies. I mean adult as in it took its subject matter seriously, even if it was about a group of rabbits finding a new home. It even looked more realistic compared to Animal Farm, so that's another reason it stood out. Interestingly enough though, despite the darker tone, many children have seen this movie. It even has a U rating, which is the equivalent of a G, basically meaning for all audiences. This showed how, much like Japanese, the British have a much different standard of what is considered okay for children. The film proved to be quite successful in many European countries, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Watership Down also had a television cartoon retelling the story. Actors John Hurt and Richard Briers from the movie version also appear in the TV show. However, it is nowhere as dark as the movie, or even the book, which could disappoint some people. It eventually gained a spiritual successor with the movie Plague Dogs, also based on a novel by Richard Adams and directed by Martin Rosen. This also features John Hurt, as well as fellow Watership Down actor Nigel Hawthorne. Plague Dogs is animated pretty realistically, and believe it or not, there was no rotoscoping used for this process. This film also has a notable ending change from the book, so mild spoiler warning, but the ending from the book was more of a happy one, while the movie was much more ambiguous and dour. Usually animated movies change an ending to be happier. It's very rare for the opposite change to take place, but then again, this was supposedly Adam's original envisioned ending. But let's get back to the 70s, as the last year of that decade had the beginning of what was considered to be the second wave. This was where the dissident art groups and politics became more noticeable in the animated properties that were made, and there were more distribution options used in the industry. Alison Duvert, who worked with Halas and Batchelor, started to work on her own with her first short, Cafe Bar, in 1975. But then really took off in 1979 with Mr. Pascal. And her peak came in 1987 with the award-winning Black Dog. She ended up becoming one of the many woman animators who rose up into prominence. Others included Karen Watson, Joanna Quinn, and Candy Gard. Watson worked on a personal short titled Daddy's Little Bit of Breast in China. By contrast, Quinn's Girls' Night Out and Gard's Fatty Issues provided a combination of social observations and humor. And speaking of Joanna Quinn, I think she's deserving of a bit more highlighting. Quinn got her inspiration for Girls' Night Out after drawing a comic strip about 4 women who go to a city club to participate in a hen night. She did further research in some clubs and became interested in the women in the audience who were viewing strippers and drag queens on stage. Wanting to challenge herself with animation, she created an anti-heroine named Beryl as the star of Girls' Night Out. In the short, she goes into a strip club to see a male stripper and hijinks ensue. It took Quinn years to complete the short, starting on it while she was still in college, and when completed, it eventually aired on Channel 4. The reception was positive enough that Channel 4 commissioned a sequel, Body Beautiful, and Quinn eventually made 2 more sequels, Dreams and Desires, Family Ties, and Affairs of the Art. All of these shorts have Beryl in a new position or having some new obsession. There is also Britannia, about a bulldog innocently playing until he becomes more greedy. The short is a commentary on the history of the British Empire, as well as colonialism. The last short to mention is Famous Fred, based on the picture book by Posey Simmons. It is about a cat who recently died, but their owners later discovered that he was secretly a rock star in the cat community. This was the short that gained Quinn a Best Animated Short Film Oscar. Joanna Quinn is also known for the animations she has created for commercials. Her best-known commercial work is for United Airlines, the Whiskas cat food brand, and Charmin toilet paper. Quinn's animation often looks exaggerated and free-flowing, which employs her own version of the boiling line. Of course, other animators came up as well, including but not limited to David Anderson, Phil Malloy, Paul Vester, and the Quay brothers. David Anderson had used stop-motion and cutouts for his work with a tinge of creepiness. Phil Malloy's films like the Cowboys series and the Ten Commandments series are more grotesque. They adopted almost a cave drawing meets macabre style. Paul Vester focused on hand-drawn animation but had some of the most abstract imagery. The Quay brothers used stop-motion, using creepy-looking doll faces for their experimental short Street of Crocodiles. Around that same time, other changes were in development. Arguably the biggest use of distribution of animation in Britain was Channel 4, which made animation feel just as important as drama or sporting events. It was not the only one to do this, but it was the most prominent in highlighting and promoting experimental and bold works, including animation. Animation had still received prominence, but mostly in shows for little children like Postman Pat and Fireman Sam. Children's comic strip character Rupert the Bear also had a short film around this time called Rupert and the Frog Song. This short film included the song We All Stand Together by Paul McCartney, which made it to number 3 on the UK singles chart. Rupert eventually got a cel-animated TV series simply named Rupert, and a stop-motion animated series called Rupert Bear, Follow the Magic. There were also shows for older children, but still technically for the whole family. Cosgrove Hall Films provided that. They had many shows like a stop-motion adaptation of The Wind of the Willows. The shows they are most well known for, however, are Danger Mouse and its spin-off Count Dacula. Dacula was actually originally a villain from the Danger Mouse show. Both did run in syndication in the United States and have some crossover appeal. Danger Mouse was popular enough to get a reboot a few decades later. At the same time, all of those initial shows existed in the 80s. The more experimental productions were not quite as well known or widely seen. This all began to change when the chief executive of the soon-to-be channel, Jeremy Isaacs, went to the Cambridge Animation Festival and convinced one of the commissioning editors, Paul Madden, to check it out for himself. When Paul did so, he was in awe with the films made by Aardman workers David Sproxton and Peter Lord. Aardman, like I said, created the character Morph, but also worked on the series animated Conversations. Paul then commissioned Aardman to make 5 films that were of a similar vein to those shorts. The deadline was too ambitious, however, but Channel 4 still gave the resulting show, Conversation Pieces, a prominent slot opposite BBC's 9 o'clock news. Aardman also directed a short of the series called Sweet Disaster, which would depict animated versions of the apocalypse. They created one of the shorts, which was titled Babylon. The other 4 shorts were made by other animators not affiliated with Aardman. Aardman were also commissioned to create music videos for artists, those being Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer, Nina Simone's version of My Baby Just Cares for Me, and Robert Parker's Barefootin'. Sledgehammer was also one of the earliest animating jobs Nick Park had for Aardman, and we will get more into that a little later. While this was happening, Paul was approached by John Coates, who represents TV Cartoons, TVC. John had optioned the rights to Raymond Briggs' children's book, The Snowman, and wanted to make it into an animated short film. It was completed on Christmas and screened on Boxing Day, becoming a Christmas classic. It received a sequel decades later called The Snowman and the Snow Dog. People did not find it that good, however, especially compared to the original. Another creation with some of the same people came in the form of When the Wind Blows. Based on a comic by Raymond Briggs, it is about an old couple trying to survive a nearly nuclear attack. Jimmy T. Murakami, who was the supervising animator on The Snowman, became the director for the project. It also involved a score by Roger Waters of Pink Floyd fame. It features animated characters with real objects around them. These objects are animated in stop motion whenever they need to move. After When the Wind Blows, more adaptations of Briggs' work came into being, which were Father Christmas, The Bear, and Ivor the Invisible. The last animated work done with one of Briggs' books was Ethel and Ernest. This was based on a graphic memoir following the life of Raymond Briggs' parents. Back in Channel 4, subsequent films after The Snowman were deemed as either documentaries or educational, making them seem more important in their airings on Channel 4, but lacked their own animation department. Finally, in 1989, Claire Kitson was hired and introduced the Formation slot, which showcased animation from both Britain and other countries. Around that same time, Channel 4 partnered with the Arts Council of England to create the Animate initiative, which was made to encourage the creation and airing of experimental animation. There was a conscious decision to focus on animated films by auteurs, people who just wished to showcase their personal expression. They wished to allow people like Alison Duvert, among other creators, to be able to get their work to a wider audience. It was a major push to have underexposed issues of ethnicity and sexuality be brought to the forefront. The political climate of the time caused the strong emergence of leftist groups, basically the dissident art groups and politics I mentioned earlier. It seemed at the same time some other shows tried to pop up in the wake of a changing landscape in British animation. One notable show is the clay model stop-motion show The Trapdoor. It was created by Terry Brain and Charlie Mills. Brain and Mills went on to make the 2D animated Stop It and Tidy Up and Bump, but Trapdoor remains their most well-remembered work. It involved monsters living in a castle, the main three being a blue creature, a spider, and a skull. The castle holds the titular trapdoor, and within it are various bizarre monsters. Most of these monsters are hostile, though some turn out to be friendly. It was humorous, but also had inspirations from dark fantasy and horror. The designs are some of the most inventive I've seen in stop motion, and it was impressive how they were able to have so many creatures on screen at the same time. The series first aired on ITV, specifically children's ITV. Eventually, though, the show aired on Channel 4. Co-creator Terry Brain later will go on to also work with Aardman. Channel 4 and their sponsored shorts ended up being considered innovative and adventurous, and gaining widespread appeal even internationally. A few of them even got nominated for or even won Academy Awards for Best Animated Short Film. One of the shorts was called Bob's Birthday, which was created by Alison Snowden and David Fine. This short later went on to be adapted into television show Bob and Margaret. The other was called Creature Comforts, which was also part of a series of shorts called Lip Sync.
Lip Sync.
Lip Sync was a series of 5 short films with a common theme being vox pop, which is a term of journalism meaning short interviews with various members of the public.
Oh, it's very, very good. Very good. Very comfortable, you know, well looked after, and it's in a nice position.
The shorts were Going Equipped, directed by Peter Lord.
Very poor. Oh yeah, I can remember things. Poor, definitely. Realizing money.
War Story, also by Lord.
I come home, I was tired. I used to go asleep in the train and home, fall out the train sometimes.
Next, directed by Barry Purves. Ident, directed by Richard Starzak. And finally, Creature Comforts, directed by Nick Park. Needless to say, Creature Comforts was the most popular of the shorts, which eventually led to advertisements, a television series, and adverts highlighting disabled people, titled Creature Discomforts. But this was not Nick Park's first project. Before he even started working in Aardman, he was creating an idea as a graduation project in 1982. He joined Aardman to work part-time, while still being funded by the school he was in. Eventually, the project he would complete around 7 years later was A Grand Day Out, starring the characters Wallace and Gromit. Wallace is an inventor who creates elaborate Rube Goldberg-esque contraptions that don't always work as planned. Gromit is an intelligent beagle who expresses himself through his facial expressions and body language, which many felt made the character a good straight man to Wallace. They often go on strange yet exciting adventures together. In the case of the first appearance, the duo go to the moon to gather cheese, while a coin of machine-operated cooker robot that lives on the moon tries to find a way to get to Earth to ski. The short became a hit and got an Oscar nomination for Best Animated Shorts, but lost to another Nick Park-directed short. The short being the previously mentioned Creature Comforts. Still, the first Wallace and Gromit short was successful enough that another was put into production. This time it was The Wrong Trousers. This involved a thieving penguin named Feathers McGraw, attempting to steal a diamond by using Wallace and Gromit's techno trousers. The short proved to be an even bigger hit than the last short, this time winning the Best Animated Short Oscar. This led to the duo's third short, A Close Shave. It involves Wallace falling in love with a woman who owns a wool shop, while Gromit is framed for a sheep-rustling crime committed by another dog. This short also won the Best Animated Short Oscar and introduced the character named Shaun the Sheep. Shaun went on to have his own series that included a TV show, television specials, and 2 movies, which will be discussed later. Shaun even spun off another show, Timmy Time, starring Shaun's little cousin. As for the inventor and his dog, they of course became icons in their own right. Canonically, Wensleydale cheese is Wallace's favorite, so they were used to help promote Wensleydale Cheese Factory when it was facing financial troubles. By the time their movie came out, Wensleydale cheese sales increased by 23%. Wallace and Gromit were popular not just in their own country, but all across the world too. They were popular in Japan, even making Hayao Miyazaki a fan. Of course, the duo's popularity led to many other projects, like 2 series, Wallace and Gromit's Crackling Contraptions and Wallace and Gromit's World of Invention. They again also gained a movie, but we'll get to that later. They did make one more Wallace and Gromit short a few years after the movie, however. The short is titled A Matter of Loaf and Death. It is about the duo running a bakery business when an assailant starts murdering bakers. Gromit has to figure out who is behind these crimes before Wallace becomes the next victim. This short also received the Best Animated Short nomination, but it did not win this time. Stop motion was and still is a big part of British animation, and the country continued making other cartoons using this technique. The British collaborated with Switzerland to create Pingu, a children's comedy show. It was popular and easy to distribute due to a made-up language in the show that they dubbed Penguinese. Pingu actually got a reboot in Japan titled Pingu in the City. There was another stop-motion show called Gogs. While it was made in Wales first, it is part of the United Kingdom and distributed in English-speaking areas, so I believe it counts. It involves a cave family that is socially inept and often get involved in dark and gross-out humor. They'll try their best to survive and even advance technology, though they would often fail miserably. It was actually a show for adults, which made it stand out from Wallace and Gromit and even The Trapdoor. While stop-motion was clearly still a primetime technique for animation in Britain, in many cases, there still existed some cel-animated shows. Some examples include The Animals of Farthing Wood and The Dreamstone. The Animals of Farthing Wood is based on a series of books and is about a group of animals being forced out of Farthing Wood due to construction. They journey to a new home and come across many trials and tribulations along the way. Even when finding a new home, they encounter new obstacles. It could be considered similar to Watership Down, even right down to the violence where characters get killed off. And yes, this was also shown to children in Britain, airing on CBBC, which is short for Children's British Broadcasting Corporation. The Dreamstone is a cartoon that takes place in the land of dreams and the land of nightmares, where a struggle between good and evil takes place. The good is represented by a Merlin-like magician known as the Dreammaker, and the evil being the Lord of Nightmares, Zordrak. The land of dreams is populated by creatures called Noops and Wats, while the land of nightmares is mostly populated by these lizard-esque creatures called Erpnies. For many people, the Erpnies were a big highlight in the show. At this time, many characters from the comic company Beano started to make their animated debut as well. There was a video called the Beano Video, which featured many of the company's characters, including Minnie the Minx, the Mash Street Kids, and the most popular, Dennis the Menace. Alright, I should explain to some people. There are 2 characters named Dennis the Menace, one from the States, the other from the United Kingdom. They both came out the same year on the same day. The planets must have aligned that day. Because of this, the US version will be simply called Dennis Dennis in the UK, while the UK version ended up being called Dennis and Gnasher in other countries. Gnasher is his pet dog, by the way, but if you were to ask me, I would take the UK version any day. In the US version, the character often ended up being a menace by accident and just really came across as boring to me. In the meantime, the UK version did not hold back, and I found the character much more interesting. He is a bad kid through and through, but he doesn't get away with his misdeeds. I always had an interest in antagonist characters, but I always felt they needed a sort of weakness to at least not feel like they're untouchable. But as far as animation is concerned, besides the Beano video, he started in his own animated show called Dennis the Menace, though later retitled Dennis and Gnasher. He is still a bad boy, though he is given heroic moments on that show. Then came a show in the 2000s also called Dennis and Gnasher, but this one toned down his behavior significantly, making him far less interesting. Oh, and I guess there was also a CGI show too. Getting back to Channel 4, their success allowed an expansion to include other animators who are not from Britain and have their own work aired on TV. There were even documentaries that aired about animation. The channel was also self-funded thanks to the Broadcasting Act of 1990, which made monetary profit the new priority for the broadcaster. The act made it so that 25% of its output has to be sourced from independent production companies. It is around this time in the late 90s that the third wave takes place, the one where the neoliberal tendencies reconsolidate in some popular commercially driven media. The Sky TV system also happened to gain some ground when it brought cartoons, amongst other properties, over from the United States from Nickelodeon, Disney Channel and Cartoon Network. Channel's 4 budget and success did still increase in the 90s. They wanted to commission a series rather than shorts, and they were considering a homegrown version of The Simpsons. Many of them tried to combine avant-garde aesthetics, subversive humor and primetime appeal in one. Shows of this type, not just on Channel 4, included Chapstone Villas, Pond Life, Stressed Eric, Bob and Margaret, Monkey Dust, Modern Tossed, I'm Not an Animal and Pope Town. The shows they made did not gain immediate success, and there were also some scheduling issues that caused many of these shows downfalls, though Crapston Villas did gain a cult following later on, and Bob and Margaret did become a hit in the United States and Canada. Claire Kitson left Channel 4 in 1999, and animation went under the management of a commissioning editor for arts and music. Animation became more marginalized on Channel 4, and many of the animators went on to make either less experimental animation or non-animated projects altogether. However, Channel 4 still sponsors a few animated films through their animation initiatives, so they have not completely abandoned their roots. It was thanks to Channel 4 that Aardman became as big of a company as it did across the globe, and so this stop-motion company gained a chance to get even bigger. They struck a deal with DreamWorks to get their movies distributed in the US, and their first feature-length film became Chicken Run. It was a prison escape-styled movie about chickens trying to escape a farm, and they think they finally found a solution when a rooster shows up. The chickens think he can fly, so they hope he can teach them to fly before all of the chickens end up killed by the farm owners. It became a hit, and there was a big push to get it nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. It received no such nomination, but the Academy Awards members admired the valiant effort so much that they introduced Best Animated Feature the very next year. It would only be a few years later when Aardman had their next film, their feature-length adaptation of their beloved Wallace and Gromit, which won the Best Animated Feature Oscar. The duo are now pest control agents who are trying to keep the rabbit population from messing with the giant vegetable competition. After they seemingly come up with a solution, however, a were-rabbit suddenly appears, and the duo now have to find and stop it. Of course, the production ran into issues in the production process, like DreamWorks making demands to recast Wallace with an actor better known in the West, or changing the name of one of the vegetables due to people in the West not being familiar with the name. Their next feature, and the last to be developed with DreamWorks, was Flushed Away, which was also the first time they completely used CGI instead of their usual stop motion, though they at least tried to have their models keep the signature Aardman look. The reason for the change was supposedly because the clay would have been difficult to work with due to all the water required for the film. Then again, considering the demands DreamWorks had for their last film, is it entirely possible that they may have pushed Aardman to go in this direction? Well, anyways, the contract between DreamWorks and Aardman was not extended due to obvious creative differences. Not to mention, the last few films did not really give DreamWorks the box office performances they were hoping for. Eventually, Aardman entered a new partnership for distribution, this time with Sony, and so far they have been treated far kinder by Sony than by DreamWorks. After another Wallace and Gromit short, they then made their next CGI feature, Arthur Christmas, and as far as looks go, it looks the most different compared to Aardman's other works. Whether that's a good or a bad thing will probably be based on your preference. The partnership continued with their next film, The Pirates in an Adventure with Scientists, based on a novel of the same name. This saw a near return to Aardman's stop motion in the movie business. Aardman's next movie was Shaun the Sheep movie, a movie that had very little to no dialogue, which is something rarely seen in animation these days. It did get a sequel called Shaun the Sheep movie Farmageddon, which involved Shaun meeting a dog-looking alien and helping it to get home. In between these two films was Early Man, though this was a big bomb for the studio financially. This is possibly because of the public's unfortunate growing disinterest in stop motion, though from some people's reactions, Early Man isn't one of Aardman's best works anyways. In the meantime, animation has found different means of being used through music. In 1990, Tank Girl creator Jamie Hewlett and Blur frontman and lyricist Damon Albarn met each other so that Hewlett could interview the band Blur for Deadline magazine. They ended up sharing a room together in 1997, and during a time when watching MTV, they felt a lot of the acts, especially the boy bands, were heavily manufactured and offered no substance. So as a commentary on this, they decided to make a manufactured band, but one that was still relatively interesting. This is where Gorillaz was born. It was a virtual band that was mainly alternative rock and art pop, but also had some other musical styles mixed in, like electronic and hip-hop. Their art style was in the vein of Hewlett's previous works and has been shown in both traditional animation and CGI. Virtual bands are certainly not new, as there existed acts like Alvin and the Chipmunks and the Archies decades ago. Also, some virtual acts have popped up before and after, though most of them haven't really had any lasting impact. I think the reason Gorillaz still interests many people besides them liking their music is that they try to flesh out the band members as much as they could. The members of the Gorillaz, 2D, Murdoch, Russell and Noodle, are not just featured in music videos but also seen in short cartoons and interviews. This helps to expand their personality and stories. There was a brief point when Ace of the Gangrene Gang from the Powerpuff Girls was a member of the Gorillaz. Hewlett and Albarn were already fans of Powerpuff Girls, and Craig McCracken seemed to be a fan of Gorillaz too, since they had a cameo in the Powerpuff Girls movie. The three also became friends, so such a crossover was not that far-fetched. The Gorillaz were also able to do something most other virtual bands did not: perform live. The band's first few live performances had Damon Albarn perform behind a Technicolor screen or silhouette behind another screen. In later performances, Albarn shows his face, but the Gorillaz are also shown on screen, syncing up with the lyrics. The band is either in 2D or 3D, and they have sometimes been portrayed by using holograms. While that is going on, in the meantime, places like the BBC decided to have animation be pushed mainly to the preschool demographic. They tended to be newer, sometimes CGI interpretations of their older characters, like Postman Pat or Noddy. Even a show called Bob the Builder, which was made in stop motion and ran for 12 years, had a CGI reboot not too long afterwards. That caused some controversy, to say the least. Even the Independent Film Association of Schools in Ireland felt that CGI was overtaking stop motion at an alarming rate. However, there were also truly new shows that cropped up and were not made with three-dimensional CGI. Examples included Sarah and Duck and Peppa Pig. I can't say that all were good, but still original at least. There have been places online where British have been displaying their own content without the hassle of rules put in place within production companies. One particular person named David Firth created the Flash cartoon Salad Fingers. It is an odd series involving a strange, thin, green man in a desolate world, often just talking to inanimate objects or himself. It was one of the early animated shows released online to become greatly successful. Eventually, one British creator managed to make a British cartoon that was intended for American television. The cartoon in question is The Amazing World of Gumball. Even though it was pitched to and then aired on Cartoon Network, it was made mostly in the United Kingdom. With the exception of the three main children, most of the cast consists of people who live in Britain, many of them often having to fake American accents. The cartoon is known well for its humor, ranging from subtle to sarcastic and even dark. It is also admired for the variety of styles and techniques implemented within the show. Gumball is probably the only thing that constantly aired on Cartoon Network almost to the same degree as Teen Titans Go, but not by that much, and it ended anyways, while Go still continues its crazy, annoying run. And that is about where British animation is at right now. We have seen what the country tends to like, and also have seen how different their works are compared to other countries. Many of these works have their own charm and impressive qualities, and some of them have gone on to become worldwide classics. I'm glad I'm able to share many of these works for you and guarantee you that there will be more to discuss. This has been Anton, and you've been watching Foreign Antoons. Cheerio!